So happy to welcome all of you to our webinar this afternoon, sharing our sacred stories, igniting a new conversation around reproductive justice. My name is Reverend Cantina Washington Leaphart, and I'm the Director of Programs for Reproductive Justice and Sexuality Education here at the Religious Institute. And I'm really excited to have several of my fantastic colleagues and friends who have answered my call to join us today to talk a little bit about the Hyde Amendment. The anniversary of the Hyde Amendment, 42nd anniversary of the Hyde Amendment, is coming up this month on September 30th. And so we want to talk about kind of where we've been, where we're going, why the Hyde Amendment continues to be so harmful, particularly to low-income folks who are seeking to have access to abortion care, and the power of story, the power of narrative, or of storytelling, really, in reclaiming the narrative from the ways that this political season and this political climate, I think, has tried to co-opt the narrative related to faith and related to bodily autonomy, and choice and access across the reproductive health spectrum, including abortion, but also across the spectrum with contraception, with adequate prenatal and postnatal care, and safe and healthy communities for women and their families. I want to do a brief introduction of our panelists that are here, and they're going to probably talk more about their own particular work and how it intersects with the work trying to eradicate and repeal the Hyde Amendment. I will start with Reverend Susan Chorley, who is here with us. Susan is an ordained Baptist minister. She's the co-founder and executive director of Exhale, which is a fabulous organization doing great work around storytelling and providing safe spaces for people who have had abortion experiences to be able to come out of the dark and to share in ways that they can reclaim their identities away from shame related to their experiences. She'll talk a little bit more about her role there. Charity Woods is also joining us today. Charity is the co-founder and managing director of Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice, IVRJ, great acronym there. And Charity also has a lot of experience in political and campaign strategy and organizing in faith spaces. And so she's going to talk a little bit about that. Carly Manis is also joining us today. Carly and I met when she was in her former role at NCJW, which is the National Council of Jewish Women. Carly has been in the trenches of reproductive justice movements for a really long time, doing so with an anti-racist lens and helping other folks to do that as well, rooted in her own faith. She works as an abortion and birth doula, and so volunteers much of her time accompanying people throughout the course or the spectrum of reproductive decision making, and has been a long time RJ advocate, and so we're grateful to have her. And finally, Latishia James-Portis, who just got married not even a week ago. Yeah, so we're excited for her new last name there. That's changed even since we started marketing the webinar. Latishia and I have gotten to know each other and worked together over this last year or so in various RJ spaces, and so I'm really excited that she was able to join us today and share some of her experiences both in the chaplaincy world and in organizing in faith spaces. Latishia currently works as the Assistant Director of Prevention and Response at Spelman College, and is doing great things in her new role there. And she is also the founder of Empathic Solutions and is O School's Reverend Pleasure. So she might share a little bit with us about what all of that means. And so today we're going to talk about storytelling. We're going to talk about action rooted in faith related to the 42nd anniversary of the Hyde Amendment and what it looks like in real time on the ground for people who are trying to access the care that they need, and doing so with lots of obstacles in front of them in many cases, including the Hyde Amendment. And to just give you all some background for those of you who may not be familiar with what the Hyde Amendment is, and we'll talk a little bit more about that more in detail, it's a legislative provision that bans the use of federal funds to pay for abortion. And like I said, it was passed on September 30th, 1976, and there has been much work over the last over many years to try to repeal this amendment unsuccessfully. And so if you are a woman or a person who is served by Medicaid, which approximately 15.6 million folks, or at least woman-identified people, fall under that category. 1 in 5 people of reproductive age 15 to 44, you are ineligible for any sort of help to pay for abortion care in a situation or circumstance where you might need it. So you can imagine the effect that has, particularly on low-income women. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I want to start with asking the question specifically for Chorley and Latishia because of the context that they have worked in, both in chaplaincy as well as in doula work, et cetera, about instances where you've seen the real consequences of the Hyde Amendment with people who are seeking abortion care or considering seeking abortion care. So maybe Chorley, we can start with you and then we'll move to Latishia.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Cantina, and thank you so much for the invite to be with this incredible panel. So I work in Washington, D.C. As a birth and abortion doula as a part of my work. And one thing that's changed really recently that is a direct response to the Hyde Amendment is there are only 5 clinics in the United States that go beyond 24 weeks and 6 days and service people looking for abortion care. And we have a lot of people, 2 of those clinics out of the 5 are in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area. And we have many patients who are coming to those clinics who were not able to get the money in time in their own home states to have procedures at an earlier date while they had wished that they could have accessed the kind of care. They were not able to because of the funding and barrier to Medicaid services in their own states, and just gathering that type of money generally was really difficult for them. So it pushed them further along in their pregnancy, and it brought them to a place where they had to seek treatment out of state. And that's been a really devastating reality, I think, to see a lot of patients in when they have to travel out of their home states. They then don't have any support networks in the DC area. So myself and my volunteers serve as their support networks. When they get here, we house them, we feed them, we ensure that they have transportation. But it absolutely changes what their experience looks like. And there's one patient in particular that when we talk about consequences of the Hyde Amendment that I think a lot about, and it was a patient in South Carolina who had been working, and South Carolina is a state where state Medicaid also does not cover abortion. And this was a low-income individual whose partner was on disability and needed to access abortion care and could not in her own, couldn't find the money to do so within the earlier weeks of her pregnancy and kept on trying to, gather the funds to do so. And eventually it was too late to access care in her own home state. And she was going to have to travel to the Washington, D.C. area. But unfortunately, she still was not able to get the money in time to come to the DC area for her procedure. So I think that's just one story that sort of illuminates one, when we think about people who have later pregnancies, we often, say that there's a cultural narrative that often, speaks to the fact that why'd they wait so long? But it's really, the Hyde Amendment is a major reason that I see people needing to wait later in their pregnancy. And it's just really devastating consequences for people.
Thank you, Chorley. Latishia?
Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be with you all today. And just want to take a moment with my chaplain hat on to say that just, really sending love and support to everyone. I know that today is a difficult day for a lot of people as we are aware of the hearings that are taking place. And so really want to just reminder for everyone to take care of themselves. And this topic as well can be very hard and heavy. So, hoping that everyone has what they need and feel supported in this moment. But glad to be here with you all. And Actually, very similar stories to Carly. So when I was a chaplain in a clinic, I was living in California at the time. And so really the main difference is that because California is such a large state, we didn't have a lot of people who were coming out of state, but we had a lot of people who were traveling very far within state because of the restrictions on the Hyde Amendment. So I worked at a clinic that was in a hospital, which was a benefit in certain ways that it was actually within a larger hospital system. But it was in San Francisco, and we definitely saw patients who were coming from Central California or from very, very far Northern California, which was at least 6, 7, 8 hours way driving. They could not afford to fly. In some instances, it really wouldn't make sense to fly. And so because of the Hyde Amendment, as Carly mentioned, a lot of those patients would have to push their dates because they could not gain access to care where they lived directly. And so they would have to save up money, not only for the procedure, but to get to San Francisco in order to, make that journey, or to save up money for childcare for the children that they have, right? And to put all of these things in place just so they could get to have this procedure, as opposed to, nope, you can just go up the street to the clinic right by your house, right? And not have to worry about all of these things. The other thing, because the clinic where we were was within a hospital system, we also saw a higher rate of terminations due to fetal anomalies. And so for those who are unfamiliar with what that means, that is when the fetus has a medical condition that is going to put its life at risk, or very likely could be fatal, either for the fetus in utero or for the birthing parent. And so often what we would see is that a lot of parents were coming in so late, not because, they were negligent, but because it was a wanted pregnancy, and they were aware of what was happening. And so, again, this was an added layer of devastation on top of all of the barriers that the Hyde Amendment puts in place, because they too then had to figure out how to travel and additional money and different things and also they're trying to wrap their mind around the fact that they even have to do this procedure in the first place, right? Because pregnancy is not going the way that they had envisioned and that they had wanted. In some of those cases, and sitting with some of those families were some of the hardest, really and truly, because it felt like they were being punished twice in a way, right? They felt like, they were already having this kind of crisis of faith around why it was that they were losing their baby. And then 2, they felt like they were being punished because of all of the hoops that they had to jump through to get this procedure that they didn't even want to do in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Latishia and Carly, for sharing those stories. It's definitely a reminder to us that in the midst of all of the political kind of ping-ponging that happens, that we see in the media and in legislatures, that there are real people behind these laws, these policies, these procedures that are put in place to act as barriers for folks to access the full spectrum healthcare that they need. There are real on the ground stories. You all just told a couple of stories, but there are many, many, many more compounded of complex lives that are intersecting at a moment where they need people need care, and they can't access it in a timely fashion because of economic and judicial or legislative of obstacles. So I appreciate both of you sharing those stories. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, this is an opportunity, or this conversation will be rooted and grounded in story. All of us are people of faith here on this panel today, and we recognize that in our religious traditions, and in many religious traditions, storytelling is at the root of when we come together for worship, when we are engaging sacred texts and thinking about how those texts intersect in our current contemporary context, how we can make sense of them and use them as tools to do good and to do justice in the world. And so we know that storytelling is absolutely important to get back to the real people and the real human beings that are affected by this law, by the Hyde Amendment and others. I asked each of the panelists to come today prepared with a story, either their own or a story that they or bits and pieces of stories that they've cobbled together along the way. And so I want to start with you, Charity, and I'd like for you to share with us the story that you brought today, and just tell us a little bit more about this story or this conglomeration of several stories, and why you chose that as sort of your grounding point for today.
Thank you, Cantina, for having me as a participant. I would like to just go back briefly to what you all were just discussing with the Hyde Amendment, to piggyback on Chorley and Latishia a little bit more. I really want to continue to lift up the disproportionate impact on women of color and poor women as a result of the Hyde Amendment, and to remind people, and I think, Cantina, you put a number out there of how many women are on Medicaid, and we're looking at basically 1 in 5 women. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that often doesn't get addressed is the impact on women in the military, Indigenous women, federal government employees, all have been impacted by the Hyde Amendment. So I definitely just kind of want to lift that up as well, and that it basically perpetuates the system of inequality, because those with private insurance and other means can access the abortion care that they need, which is a right and part of the full spectrum of reproductive health. And so I think that's really important to stress that. To talk about the story piece, this work and being a reproductive justice advocate, we are, our work is so meshed and tied into storytelling and really centering the lived experiences of people. And then that is very, very important. And so one story, I think of so many different people, but one that really stands out for me, a couple of years ago, I was co-facilitating a pastoral care training for reproductive decision-making and loss. And so we discussed the whole totality of reproductive decision-making, from abortion to infertility and all types of things, adoption. And we were in a church, and we had a young Black woman come in, and she said, I know I wasn't invited, but I saw the sign. I like to come in and participate. And so she did. And we could see she was really sort of soaking in the information. And then she started sort of putting some of her own experiences into the room. And within about 10 or 15 minutes, we found out she was a single mother, 4 children. She was pregnant again, did not know who the father was. We picked up that there was probably some trauma related to that pregnancy. And so she really just needed support and help and connection to resources. But what she also needed was to feel like she had a space where faith could really hold her down and support her. And as we gathered around her and we said, hey, would you like for us to not only pray for you, but pray with you? And she said, yes, I would like that. And she broke down. And I rarely have seen someone break down like this in this situation. And it just stuck with me for weeks afterwards. And I can't remember exactly what she said, but at one point she yelled out something like, God forgive me. And you could hear that she was carrying a lot of trauma and stigma and shame, and that she had been judged. And she was looking for that connection because she was still a person of faith. and that was still important to her. And so she was seeking that connection. And so I think about her and people like her, women like her, in doing this work, and that we have so many people of faith. I mean, when we think about who's sitting in our pews in church, 1 in 3 women having an abortion. I mean, we really have got to have this discussion, and sharing these stories is so important to humanize this issue and to put a face to it.
Thank you so much, Charity. And that was really, I can imagine that was a very powerful moment, both for her, just kind of walking in off the street and not even knowing that she was walking into a space where her story was being told, where she could be her full self, and that you all were there to journey with her in that time and space. And so thank you for sharing that. And Susan, that brings me to you, you have a history of telling your own story in many ways, and how that sort of thrust you into kind of a spotlight that I don't know that you were expecting to have at that time. And as, of course, the work that you've been doing with Exhale around storytelling and holding space for folks who need to talk to someone about their experiences, and collecting those stories, as well as just being on the other end of a phone for folks. And so share with us what you brought today, and why you chose this story.
Sure. Thank you to the Religious Institute and to you, Cantina, for having all of us today. Really honored to be here. And, really holding on to, as several of the other panelists brought up, this moment, and as a survivor, just very overwhelmed the last couple of weeks around the stories that are coming out, sexism and its impact on our society, and in our faith communities, and really thinking about that in the context of this conversation as well. So what a time we are in, a shifting time, I believe, but we don't know quite where we're going to come out. So yes, my name is Susan Chorley. I helped found Exhale, an after abortion counseling talk line, about 17 years ago. There were 5 of us that came together and recognized that there wasn't a space outside of the political fight to have a conversation around our abortion experiences. And so we started with 3 cell phones and a group of volunteers, and have continued on for the last 17 years, listening to people's stories, confidential stories on the line, and supporting different storytelling initiatives nationally, both virtually and in person. And about 2 years ago, there was an opportunity for me to share my story publicly, and I decided to do that. As a mom and as a minister, I had had an abortion, and knew that it wasn't something that I could speak about publicly. So 12 years later, decided to speak about it and talk about my faith and how God was with me through that experience, and how I was continuing to sort of uncover my understanding around reproductive health care, my identity as a mom, and my identity as a minister, and having made this decision. And I think, today, the reason why I was really excited about this conversation is, for the last 12 years, I've been engaged in work around domestic violence, and worked in a domestic violence program that was affiliated with a Unitarian Universalist denomination here in Boston. And, countless stories of survivors, either on our hotline or in person in our shelter or in our community-based programs, that, to me, I think, what Exhale focuses on is the stigma, is shifting the stigma around abortion. And I think that, the Hyde Amendment adds another layer to the stigma. And so many of the immigrant women, poor women, women who were survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, and then didn't have access to healthcare, or felt like sort of jumping through the hoops to get access, felt even more judgmental. And many of the women that we serve here in Boston are also Catholic. And so I think the extra layer of the messages of the Catholic, not all Catholics, but of sort of the greater Catholic Church is that abortion is a sin, and you're not welcome here. And so I think all of those layers of oppression that go on top of a woman, not to mention sexism, and then trying to figure out, how do I parent, how do I live, how do I, do the best that I can with the circumstances that I'm in, while also dealing with the trauma. So I think, I think of lots of different stories of women that I listened to through that time. And, it was very interesting having founded Exhale 17 years prior and then working in the domestic violence field, 10 years later, and seeing the overlaps around the stigma of lived experience.
Susan, I really appreciate you bringing up your domestic violence work too. I was thinking about that as I was writing down notes to introduce all of you, and I neglected to include that. But that was really important because I'm thinking about this term that you just used, the layers of oppression. And Charity brought it up earlier today as well, thinking about women for whom, and even in this current climate where we're talking about sexual assault and sexual violence in the public sphere all the time, who are experiencing pregnancy that was a result of sexual violence. And not always just the sexual violence or rape that we might think about kind of that's happening in their homes, that's happening not just by someone that they don't know, or some other kind of way that people may try to categorize that rape only specifically happens in one kind of context with one kind of person, but coercive pregnancies or pregnancies that are unwanted because you are in a domestic violence situation, such that you don't have control over your own body. Or in a circumstance where your partner refuses to use any sort of contraception in concert with you to help prevent this pregnancy, that may not be a good situation clearly it's not a good situation to be bringing a child into. And so again, I think bringing it back to real people with real lives. This is not a conversation about folks who just are doing this because it's a fun thing to do. Like, this is actually, for many people, a very complex decision. For some, it is traumatic, not for all, certainly. But Susan and I particularly have had a lot of conversation about expanding the dialogue that we have about post-abortion conversations to include women for whom it was the right decision that they had to make at that time, and they still feel some level of grief or sadness about having made that decision, that there was a potential for something that was not to be because it just wasn't the right time or the right set of circumstances, to make sure that we are including their voices in conversations about choice. And that, I think, is really a reproductive justice framework conversation where we're considering the totality of women's lives and lived experiences beyond just this one moment or one decision that they make. So thank you for sharing that and reminding us about the domestic violence piece that is often there for many women or many people. I sent all of you this quote that I happened to see in the comments of a Facebook status last week by an activist, Ruby Sales, and she said this about storytelling. And I wanted to kind of maybe talk a little bit about it with you all, as all of you have shared specific stories or bits and pieces or your own stories. She said that there's a trend to tell individual stories which dangerously raises up individualism and extracts individuals from community. When we focus on stories at the expense of other data, we create the pitfalls that allow the charge of subjectivity to denigrate our recapitulation of our history. We enter into a world where one person's story is pitted against another without the breadth of historical voices providing continuity. she goes on to say, it reduces serious issues to a folksy conversation, robbing it of its systemic roots and unbroken presence. And so I was sat with this quote for a long time because I didn't think that she was saying that storytelling in and of itself is bad. Like, I wasn't reading that into it, but she did really make me sit and think about how we harness or not the power that we have in telling both our own stories as well as the stories of other people. It made me think about an article that I saw recently in a bioethical journal about chaplains making the decisions about how much of their of patient stories they would tell, like in verbatims or different conversations, like who gets to decide whose story we tell or not, etc. And so all of this is kind of swirling around, and that, of course, was talking through race and class, etc. But I wonder what you all are thinking about that. Like, how can we both how can we tell stories in a way that's responsible, in a way that is driven both by the narrative itself and by the data that backs it up, but making sure that we're doing it in a responsible way. Latishia, how about we start with you, if you're ready?
I love this question. When you sent out the questions, I was like, yes. I can't wait to talk about this. So a few things for me. I think the primary, what I'm hearing and what Ruby is saying in this quote that you pulled is that the need and really the imperative for us to tell more complete stories. And what it automatically made me think of is, working, we all either work in or have worked in nonprofits, and when, we have to apply for a grant or something of that nature. And I used to work specifically with youth in a nonprofit. And when it came time for us to write a new grant, it always made my stomach hurt because we had to walk this fine line of giving them just enough trauma so that they'll take pity on us and want to give us money, right? But not too much that they get turned off. And so this idea, and it's been talked about a lot in fundraising communities, is this idea that we have to almost peddle trauma porn in order to get our work funded. And so what I was hearing in this was the ways that we have truly limited people's stories. We have truly taken the fullness and the completeness of people's lives and turn them into these sound bites and these anecdotes that we peddle, that we're kind of peddling around, right? So that we can get the money that we need to do this work, right? In order to help these same people. But it's this really awful catch-22 that we've gotten ourselves caught up in. And so when I say that we need to tell more complete stories, what I mean is the contextualization of stories. And because we're all people of faith on this panel, I feel like, I can also talk about, when we talk about the Bible, we talk about the ways that sometimes the Bible is co-opted or, things are pulled out of context. One of the best gifts seminary ever gave me was the recontextualization of biblical narrative and biblical text. Don't just take this thing that you heard, this quote that you've heard out of context, right? Put it back in its original context. Do the work of researching what were the social historical narratives happening around the time that this was said, what was going on. And we need to do the same thing with our stories right now. We need to, not just take these sound bites and take these small things and the things, the high voltage trauma that's going to get us the views and the bucks, right? No, recontextualize that person, treat them like a whole person that they are, with the layers and the complexities. And I think for so long, within reproductive rights, we've been afraid to do that because we think it means that it'll be easier for our movement to get picked apart or things like that. But what reproductive justice says is no, take the fullness of it all, right? Like, we are intersectional beings. We have layers. We contain multitudes. And so when I try to tell stories, I always try to hold the both and. For anyone who knows me, they know that I talk about this a lot, of living in the both and, right? It doesn't have to be either or all the time, that you can have someone who very much so is committed to having a termination of a pregnancy, and also that person can mourn the loss of what could have been. It doesn't have to be, they don't have to be at odds with one another. And for me, I saw that a lot in my work at the clinic. The majority of the people that I offered pastoral care to were people who wished things could have been different, but knew that they were making the right decision for where they were at the time. And still had some sadness and had some grief around what they were going through. And, you know, being able to hold the complexity of those emotions and of those things for them was really something that they were not getting in other areas of their lives.
Thank you, Latishia. That was great. Carly, did you have anything to add, particularly related to folks that you're working with who are in the late, well, actually, because you're both a birth doula and an abortion doula, so you're seeing this on kind of both sides of the spectrum there, but particularly dealing with folks who are in later stages and may be struggling with how that is for them.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I think what Latishia said, I am fully behind in terms of what we're talking about when talking about narratives and funding. And I think the way that the reproductive rights movement has gone is sort of this push to have everyone doing storytelling, because storytelling is what a lot of funders are excited about, but in a way that I think takes away from the fullness. And I think when I think about storytelling, I'm thinking about it from a place of personal healing. I don't want people to have to tell their stories because a big organization asks them to, or because they feel pressured to, but storytelling is a way for people to heal. It is, people tell their stories when they feel like it's the time for them to tell their stories. They can tell them whatever way they want to, whatever words, as messy, as, you know, eloquent, whatever comes out of their mouth in sharing their own experience. It should be healing for them, or just fully their choice, however they want to say it. So I think that's, for me, a little bit of what Ruby's getting at. In that I agree with you, Cantina. I don't think Ruby's saying storytelling is bad. I think what I'm hearing is that storytelling, and the way that it has been manipulated by movement spaces for the purpose of funding and capitalism, which are unfortunately real things, and we need money to do this work, is doing a disservice to the end goal of justice and equity for all. That the type of storytelling that we're doing right now isn't serving us in the way that we want it to. So I think that's a bit of what I'm hearing from this quote. I hope that answers.
Charity or Susan, did you have anything that you wanted to add as well?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this one. Like Latishia, this question made me think of several different things. And so obviously I'm coming from my lens and perspective as a Black woman. So I think, first and foremost, what does storytelling mean in my community and in my culture, and the role that it has played in liberation, and, as Carly said, sort of being a cathartic exercise, a powerful tool for others, to show people that, you know, you're not alone, that there are other people out there who may have had similar experiences. And then from a faith perspective, also to serve as a testimony in a lot of ways. And I think that that's important. And that's sort of what I have and hold with me when I think about storytelling. I think you all are absolutely correct when you say that basically it has been used negatively sometimes in our movement. And I'm particularly sensitive to that because some of the most traumatic and tragic stories, particularly around race and economics and access to rights are coming from people of color. And so that in itself creates a bit of an imbalance. And so I think about that. And then the other thing that I'm thinking about in regards to what Ruby said, and I was sort of going back and listening again to some of her speaking and speeches, and this sort of intersects with some conversations she's had around identity. But what I also think she's saying is, these individual stories are important and to have that individual aspect. But as you talk about these stories and experiences, there's a whole backstory there, right? So you carry all of this history to this moment and to these experiences, and they impact those experiences. And so what I think she's also saying is there's also this individual perspective, but it's also part of a larger narrative and story, and that sometimes you really need to think about that and how you're responsible and accountable around that, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Susan?
I love this question. I really resonate with what folks have been saying. Exhale created an ethical story sharing guide that's on our website. A lot of sexual assault and domestic violence programs also now have ethical story sharing guides that you can find. I know that Boston Area Rape Crisis Center has one on their website that's super helpful, just in terms of, how you support a storyteller and how you don't just throw someone into either a grant or a public speaking moment, for an event without thinking about, how much of your story do you want to share? What's the purpose? What's the point and the goal behind it? And I think the other thing that I didn't really recognize until I was a public storyteller, I preached about my abortion in 8 different churches across the country. And the emotional drain of sharing that story is enormous. And I think that, I think another thing that we could think about is how do we provide support, real support for storytellers. I think a lot of people have really stood up for Christine Blasey. Sorry, all of a sudden I forgot her last name, Ford. And I mean, I think that that's wonderful. And I know a lot of survivors that are feeling like, wow, nobody stood up for me when I told my story. In fact, people moved away or didn't want me to tell my story, which I know is also happening with her. I also just think in terms of this quote and sort of the conversation that's happening, it's important as a storyteller to identify, what you know and what you don't know. I think myself, having gone through a court litigation around domestic violence, I'm a straight, white, middle-class woman, and my experience of that was very traumatic, and I am living in a very significant place of privilege. So what's it like for other people? And I often bring that up because if it was hard for me, I recognize that it's really, really hard for other people with other, layers of oppression on top of them. And then there's an awesome TED Talk, which I'm sure folks have heard, The Danger of a Single Story. Chimamanda Adichie, I think is her name. I just think that that's a super helpful resource and framing of what folks were sharing around the complexity and sort of understanding that there's a story behind every story, and there's multiple stories behind every story.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for continuing to remind us about, because Ruby does also talk about that in this quote about privilege and how the different spaces and places that we all sit in or that people sit in impact the layers, as we talked about, in terms of what is in their story. Like your experience as a white, middle-class, straight identified woman going to court related to domestic violence is going to be completely different in many ways than a poor Black, queer person who is experiencing that and that similar story in terms of the domestic violence itself. And so how do we hold up both stories, because both stories are important, while not participating in the trauma porn kind of and voyeuristic sort of pieces of that puzzle as well. I wanted to, in our final few minutes here, ask each of you, Susan, you brought up something about emotional drain, the drain that people feel by continually telling their stories, and ways that we have to kind of take care of ourselves when we're telling those stories, as well as when we are holding space for and hearing the stories, because perhaps in that moment it isn't our story, but we are making ourselves available to open up our hearts and to hold space for a person who needs to share something related to something traumatic. And as we're seeing right now play out on television and on Facebook Live related to this hearing that's going on, and the ways that the media has been playing this out over the last couple of weeks, we're bombarded in every way, and people who are survivors are consistently finding themselves triggered by the constant kind of chatter of what's going on around us. And so I wonder if each of you might offer some practical and maybe even some intangible kind of spiritual ways that you make room for refilling your cup after the emotional drain of this work, whether it is as a listener or as a participant in sharing your story as a survivor. Because a lot of the conversation that we've continued to have in movement spaces, I think over the last couple of years in particular, is about resiliency and how are we, through this long marathon of craziness, chaos that it feels like we're living in many days. How are we taking care of ourselves and taking care of those folks around us to be able to refill our cups after they get emptied out time and again? And so maybe Latishia, if we might start with you, thinking about your orientation in the world as a person who has been in chaplaincy spaces and is a deep listener, as well as a survivor. Like how are you navigating those spaces?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So for those that are with us and who may not know, during the day, one of the main parts of my role is to give support to survivors of sexual assault, relationship violence, stalking, and or gender-based violence and discrimination. So I hear stories all the time that are very and can be very deeply traumatic. Some of these things cross-cut in a lot of ways, right? We've already talked about the layers of oppression and intersectionality, and so they cross-cut with a lot of other reproductive justice issues, whether they be pregnancy or whether they deal with economic issues or what have you. So yes, so I do hear kind of a breadth of stories regularly. For me, it actually starts within the listening itself. And how I try to take care of myself is, and also in helping that person, is once they've finished, if there are questions, if there are things, if they need support, I actually try to help them find their resiliency in the moment. So I remember very clearly a woman at a clinic that I had worked with. She was very much so grieving, feeling a lot of shame around her decision. And she kept talking about the other children that she already had. And, that if they were to find out one day when they got older, like what they would think of her. And so I remember taking a moment, taking a step back and just telling her, like, look at how amazing you are. You have these beautiful children that you are already raising by yourself. Like, look at all of these things that you have already done to get here. Look at how brave you are. And that really helped her in the moment. And then it in turn helped me, because then it's not just about the trauma or the pain of her story. It also became about, her courage and her resiliency and all of the other things that were within her story. and not just the tragedy of it, right? Of the narrative. And so typically it starts there for me, that it's like, yes, you know, these things are happening, but also can you look further? Can you look deeper into what this person is going through to help them build up their own resiliency, their own coping skills for how it is they're going to get through this situation. So that's the first thing. The second thing I do is that I have really, really amazing wife who lets me vent. And that helps a lot. I tell people all the time, you have to get the things out of your head, even if it's just writing them down, if it's venting, whatever it may be. Get it out of your head. Otherwise, I don't know about you all, but I'm the type of person that I will just play things on a loop over and over and over again. And so getting it out of my head is really helpful in any way possible. And then trying to be better about staying off of social media. I know it might be the cliche thing that a lot of people are saying these days, but honestly, it's so helpful. I have my moments where I'll delete Facebook and Twitter off of my phone completely, and not even like be able to access it from my phone for like a few weeks at a time, just so that I'm not tempted, and give me some space to really clear and to stay away from those types of things. So those are just a few that I do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Charity, what about you?
I really love what Latishia said about the empowerment piece, because once again, as a reproductive justice advocate, that's a really important part of the work for me, is to figure out how can you help facilitate that empowerment of someone, and to help build up their resiliency, their healing, their leadership. All of that I think is really important. Also, I have a wonderful husband who probably gets tired of me running my mouth sometimes. It ranges from sometimes a really low sort of upset kind of energy, and it can go to, you know, fury and rage and anger and but so I'm really glad that I can, not just him, but the rest of my family, and have support from family and friends. And so I think that is super, super important. And just my own sort of spirituality and my faith, which sometimes I feel is strengthened by this work, and sometimes is temporarily weakened, you know, and that's sort of my process, and going through that, and sort of reconnecting and tapping in again to try to get that feeling of wholeness, but really feeling like my work is ordained by God. That doesn't mean that I'm, you know, some specially appointed or chosen person. I think that can be anybody. And I think that's important too, when we talk about working in the sort of religious and faith field. A lot of times we get caught up in labels and titles and hierarchy, but as just someone, just me, and my own understanding of my faith, that's what really pushes me. And then just knowing that when I get weak and tired and going through all of this, that there's somebody out there carrying an even heavier burden. And that just keeps pushing me to want to help and want to do more. And also recognizing these experiences in my life and the people close to me. And it really makes it real, and once again puts a face on it and humanizes it. I'm still trying to figure some of this out and where I can get my support and strength and release. Also, the community of people I think we all work with in a larger sense in this movement is important too, and that we are able to have discussions like this, and when we get together in a room, we can say, hey, are you good? Everything okay? What are you going through in your life, even outside of your work? What are you personally dealing with right now? That's a lot. I know when the shootings were occurring, when we were seeing, as we're still seeing, a lot of Black men dying at the hands of state-based violence, you know, focusing on, for example, working in reproductive health, rights, and justice, and doing, at the time, pastoral care trainings and dealing with these issues, but then also having to go home and be terrified about my Black husband going outside in the street and what could happen to him. And so carrying all of that and you know, amongst other things, and the young Black girl that I'm raising, and teaching her how to be resilient and how to lean into her power and strength. So, you know, we're carrying all of this with us all the time, and it's all intersecting, and making sense of it can be very overwhelming. But I just encourage people, you know, the first step is to reach out and talk and share stories when appropriate. And yeah, I mean, you kind of have to figure out what works for you. And for me, it's sort of a hodgepodge of things, and it's always evolving and changing.
Thank you. Carly?
Yeah, I think what's been said are all excellent things that I lean on as well. I think what Charity just said about, like, there's a community of people who are doing this work. There are a number of us here right now on this webinar. And so I really rely on my friends who are also doing this work so that we can relate to one another. I typically do my doula shifts in clinics in the DC area on Saturday mornings, which means Friday night is Shabbat. So it's the perfect time for me to actually use my faith to intentionally take a moment to, you know, be in community and to be with people who, you know, fill up my cup in so many metaphorical and tangible ways, and to be together in my faith practice before I go into what I know is going to be an emotionally draining and trying, you know, 6-7 hours, particularly because I think the thing that drains me the most is the question that most of my patients ask me before their procedures, which is, will God forgive me? That's the number one question that I get from all patients that I see who, you know, have wildly different faith backgrounds, but that is the most common. And that's something that really just breaks my heart every time I have to answer it. But I think, you know, leaning on community, leaning into my faith practice, making intentional time for myself to be with the people that I love and that support me is the, you know, most important way for me to move through the work.
And Susan?
Yeah, I too really like what folks said. One thing that came to me was, I haven't thought of this before, but I feel like the last few weeks I've been having holy rage conversations with God. And just, I mean, literally like just shouting and screaming and feeling so lost and confused, and knowing that in the wilderness, you know, God is there, and it's really lovely to know that, and also to be surrounded by a circle of women and others, including men, who really love me and believe in me and believe my story. And I think that's really important. I love what Latishia said about, you know, knowing, I don't know if these were the words she used, but like knowing the wisdom and the people that are sharing traumatic stories. We all have our own wisdom. We can all find it. It's not on us as clergy people or as advocates or listeners to provide the wisdom. You know, people have it innately within them. And I also love to sing. So that's another part of breathing and singing.
And you run too.
I do run. It's true.
which is also
running the Marine Corps Marathon at the end of October. So I'll be breathing a lot during that.
I've heard that running can be also a very therapeutic experience for folks to get out there and get some of that energy out. I appreciate each and every one of you for taking the time to prepare to be on this call today, to bring the stories and the fullness of all of who you are and the wonderful work that you have done and that you're continuing to do in each of your unique placements and settings and callings and giftings in the world. And I thank you for just pouring yourself out, whether it is with holy listening, whether it's with being on the public square protesting, whether it's with sitting next to folks who are in the clinics making these decisions, or traveling around the country telling your story, or convening trainings to try to help clergy and others be better at giving care or sitting in courtrooms and advocating for students. All of you are doing that work and so much more in the midst of just trying to have your own human experience as well. And so I'm just really appreciative of the ways that you have shared just a little bit in an hour that I think is going to be really impactful for our audience, both those who were able to listen in real time or who will listen to the recording later. We've got some great tweets that have been out in the Twitter sphere, so please take a look at those and retweet them if you haven't already. But we're really appreciative of all of you. And, you know, we have to keep the faith that the Hyde Amendment hopefully eventually will be repealed, and so that we won't have to have this conversation rooted in, you know, low-income women and pregnant people trying to access the critical care that they need and not having access to that because of their economic condition. And so, you know, we will continue to do the work and continue to ignite, as the panel discussion theme said to us, to ignite these stories, to bring them out of the shadows, and to share the wholeness and fullness of people's experiences, lived experiences, as they try to make these very complex decisions about their reproductive health care. So thank you to each of you for joining us today. And thank you for all of you who are watching and listening with us out in the audience. Please stay tuned as we will continue to have more webinars, more conversations about these very important issues related to reproductive justice and faith. Continue to do your work in your own communities of faith and your own larger public communities to advocate alongside those folks who need it the most. Thanks, everyone.